You kneeling under torchlight inside a sealed burial chamber, the air thick with dust and resin, the stone walls sweating faintly from centuries of humidity. You reach for a folded length of papyrus wrapped in linen, and the smell of bitumen and spices rises into your face. You open it and find diagrams, explicit invocations, and instructions that claim to bind the living and the dead through acts no modern handbook of Egyptology mentions. What you learned in school about mummies, gods, and afterlife rites does not explain this. The evidence I will show comes from conservation reports, unpublished field diaries, forensic bone analysis, and translations of fragments kept in private archives. The human cost of these procedures is not abstract. It questions who had the right to decide which bodies were honored and which were used as instruments of power. Some collections hid these pages for decades. Museums closed rooms, catalog numbers were changed, and field notes were redacted. If you are ready for what follows, leave a like and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Now we move from the waxed linen in your hands to the wider world that made such pages possible. The central claim is stark. For long spans of late period and the early Ptolemaic age, certain ritual practices combined embalming and staged possession to reconfigure social roles. This was not isolated magic. It was an organized office that answered to local temples and to officials who used ritual performance to reinforce hierarchies. There are inscriptions that refer to an office of mimicry inside several temple complexes, lists of participants carved in side chambers, and apocryphal entries in chronicle-style papyri that describe processions where the living were made to act as vessels. These are not poetic metaphors. Cross-referencing temple inventories, restoration bills, and contemporaneous chroniclers produces a web of material proof. To understand why these practices seemed logical to contemporaries, we need the cosmology that tied identity to ritual function. In this worldview, the boundary between person and role was porous. The temple was a machine that repurposed bodies to hold divine attributes. Possession was described as a transfer of potency rather than a seizure. Priests and priestesses trained in vocal formulas, prescribed ointments, and mimicry of godlike gestures. Embalming was both preservation and activation. Text fragments speak of anointing with salted oils, while recitations coaxed the breath to move in set patterns. The ruler, the great officiant, was seen as the conduit who could authorize a living transfer of agency. When that authority extended to servants or captives, the line between devotion and coercion vanished. Temple accounts list payments not only for linen and resin, but for staged costumes, performers, and the upkeep of underground cells labeled with single words that later catalogers tried to scrub from inventories. Evidence surfaces in the most ordinary and the most technical places. A storage crate labeled restoration tools contained a rolled band of papyrus with faded red ink. Diagrams that match a skeleton found in a secondary chamber. Radiocarbon dating placed the papyrus within a decade of the burial. A CT scan of the skeletal remains revealed bone markers consistent with repeated restraint and with healed fractures that did not match battle trauma. Dr. Amina El-Sayed, the archaeologist who excavated the shaft, remembers the moment. "We expected votive offerings," she says. "We did not expect procedural lists." Professor Marcus Hale, a forensic anthropologist, described the lesions as indicative of chronic immobilization and of interventions near the neck. Laila Nassar, the restorer who handled the papyrus, documented stains that are organic and protein-based, consistent with bodily fluids used in ritual anointment. Karim Suleiman, the museum keeper who inherited the collection, found marginal notes in a 19th century field diary by a chronicler named Yusuf el-Qadim that admitted removal of pages from initial publication. Their exchanges were immediate and raw. Dr. Amina: "We found the papyrus at the base of a coffin. It was folded in linen." Professor Marcus: "The bones show repeated microfractures along the wrists. That is not accidental." Lila. Under magnification, the ink sits in grooves cut into the papyrus. Someone wrote and scored with intent. Kareem. There was a ledger that mentioned an office of imitation. The last curator crossed it out. Dr. Amina. The layering of soot suggests the papyrus was used in ritual, not as a record. Professor Marcus. The vertebrae show signs of tight constraint in flexion, consistent with forced postures. Lila. The stains matched proteins from both human and animal mixed with aromatic resins. Kareem. I found a dismissed letter in a storage box where a field director asked for silence about a festival that went wrong. Dr. Amina. When you read the phrases about calling the living to emulate the deity, you realize it is operational. Professor Marcus. It changes how we read the ritual skeletal record across the site. Lila. Conservation reports were amended. Pages were whitewashed in some catalogs. Kareem. Several collectors abroad were offered parts of the archive under vague provenance notes. If this unsettles you, you are not alone. If you would like to share a reaction, start your comment with rediscovery and tell us what find you think merits a second look. Your comments help direct which fragments we will request access to next and show institutions' public interest in transparency. Many viewers have said in previous videos that their responses pushed curators to open otherwise closed drawers. Now back to the evidence trail. The protagonist of this investigation is not a politician or a royal, but a conservator named Hassan el-Mahi, who became a whistleblower. His childhood in a riverside village exposed him to temple festivals where music and masks dominated. Later, trained as a restorer in Cairo, Hassan learned to read restoration pencil marks from the 19th century and to follow the hidden catalogs that sat behind public inventories. His formation was irregular. He apprenticed under Lila and traveled Kareem to receive fragments from private estates. He lost his sister Miriam during a reconstruction of a local shrine when a ritual performance collapsed into violence. That loss pushed him from passive registrar to activist. He began photographing inventory numbers and cross-checking them against field diaries. When a senior curator tried to silence his inquiries, Hassan copied pages and sent them to an independent journal. Today, he faces legal threats and institutional ostracism, but he continues to press for full disclosure. This backstory explains why one person dedicated to restoration and truth could shift the narrative, and why his own grief made him intolerant of sanitized records. Alongside Hassan appear at least 6 named secondary figures whose actions shape the story. Dr. Amina El-Sayed led the excavation and insisted on proper documentation. Professor Marcus Hale ran the forensic analysis and challenged initial interpretations. Lila Nassar performed restoration and noted anomalies in staining. Kareem Suleiman managed the acquisitions ledger and kept private notes. Yusuf al-Qadim, the 19th century chronicler, left a handwritten field diary with erratic honesty. Miriam el-Mahdi, Hassan's sister, was a performer associated with a local festival. Each of these people is cited in reports, and their actions from discovery to publication affect how the archive was assembled or altered. There are 3 moments of extreme tension that define the investigation. The first occurs the night the papyrus was unrolled in the depot and a previously anonymous ledger name was revealed. A group of curators argued until the late hour. Voices rose and the lights were nearly turned off to prevent any recording. The debate was not merely academic. Careers were on the line, and several officials feared that public scandal would undermine funding for the museum. The air smelled of coffee and old paper, and the leather chairs creaked under impatience. Hassan remembers a hand slamming a table and a whispered threat about lost donations. The second moment of tension follows the publication of preliminary forensic findings. Professor Marcus received anonymous threats. His lab email was flooded with denials and accusations of fabrication. A reconstruction of the festival, published in a regional newspaper, led to protests outside the museum. Families of named participants demanded redaction, and a panel convened to decide whether to delay release. The museum director paused the online post and ordered a review of the data. That pause cost months of trust. The third moment is physical. During an attempt to open a sealed side chamber at dawn, workers refused to descend. Rumors spread that the chamber contained things that violated taboos and that local clergy would take offense. Negotiations with community leaders stretched into the afternoon. When the chamber was finally opened, the smell of preserved resin and the sight of nested boxes confirmed worst fears. Emotions unspooled into accusations, and the police were called. The discovery became a flashpoint between scholarly inquiry and public sensibility. Beyond drama, the technical processes matter. Radiocarbon dating was performed on both linen and papyrus samples using accelerator mass spectrometry and calibrated to regional curves. CT scanning used low-dose protocols to produce high-contrast images of thoracic and cervical bones, revealing microcalluses and periosteal reactions. Protein residue analysis isolated collagen fragments matching bovine and human sequences, which, when cross-checked against resin profiles, indicated mixed organic applications consistent with ritual anointments rather than mere embalming. These technical steps are concise but crucial to build a chain of custody and to verify that the papyrus and the remains were contemporaneous and functionally linked. The festival that appears in multiple sources gives us a centerpiece. Imagine drums thrumming in a night courtyard, torches lined along colonnades, incense burning into a thick blue haze. Performers wore painted masks and moved in precise mimicry of divine gestures. At the center of the court, a small group of participants lay in prepared trenches, immobilized by linen and ropes, while priests chanted phrases found on the recovered papyrus. Sounds of metal and ceremonial clapping punctuated the incantations. A foreign chronicler described the scene with disgust, noting the way the audience cheered when a mimic rose and spoke with a voice not his own. The sensory detail is deliberate. The scratch of sand against sandals, the sting of resin on palms, the metallic taste of sweat. Witnesses described possession as both spectacle and sacrament. Foreign visitors recorded these festivals in letters that circulated among merchants and seamen. Travelers who later published sanitized accounts often omitted the footnotes that hinted at coercion. The festival fused religion and performance, devotion and control, public praise and private harm. The reaction and suppression that followed were systematic. Several leading institutions edited exhibition catalogs, removing photographs and reassigning accession numbers. An archival box labeled with a temple name was split and sections were dispersed to private collectors. A conservative cohort within the scholarly community argued that publication would erode public trust in preservation practice. Pressure came from donors and from political figures who feared unrest among conservative constituencies. Some reports were altered under the pretext of protecting cultural heritage. Others were simply misfiled and never recovered. The result was a fractured record that benefited those who controlled access. Transitioning toward decline, we find legal and cultural reforms that gradually eroded the ritual office. New administrators forbade certain kinds of staged possession in temple precincts and codified limits on public performances. The offices that once organized mimicry lost funding and were reclassified under devotional education. Survivors of the events became silence keepers for decades, reluctant to speak. Over time, some practices retreated into regional festivals while others disappeared entirely. The institutions that had once protected their own reputations shifted to a rhetoric of modernization, arguing that reform saved heritage from sensationalism. The political consequence was a loss for historical truth, even as immediate social conflict was contained. 1 month after the disclosure, Hassan and a small team published a dossier online with translations, scans, and a reconstruction video. Dr. Amina posted field photos and Professor Marcus released anonymized forensic data. The story reached national news. The museum issued a cautious statement promising a review. A coalition of 5 independent researchers requested access to sealed boxes. Local activists organized a panel that included descendants of festival participants. Funding agencies demanded audits. The initial reaction was chaotic but consequential. The museum removed a curator and promised to release a full catalog online within 90 days. Legal threats against Hassan intensified but were countered by petitions and international attention. 3 months later, an interdisciplinary article appeared in a peer-reviewed journal that reinterpreted several temple records. The publication included calibrated radiocarbon curves and the protein analysis summary. University courses revised their modules, and a leading archaeology department launched a seminar series on ritual performance and coercion. The museum completed a digital inventory of previously closed holdings, and several pieces were temporarily relocated for independent review. Some private collectors returned fragments after public pressure. The debate shifted from isolated scandal to a wider reassessment of how institutions curate sensitive material. New terms of access were drafted, and a formal committee was created to evaluate contested archives. 6 months on, the impact widened. An advocacy group formed to demand reparative acknowledgement for communities affected by historical rituals. The museum held a public symposium with participants including Karim Suleiman, Layla Nassar, and representatives of local communities to discuss ethical stewardship. Hassan continued to work with journalists and legal counsel to protect whistleblowers. Several museums agreed to joint protocols for disclosure and for working with descendant communities. Policy changes were proposed in cultural heritage law to require transparent catalogs and to penalize undisclosed alterations. Academics proposed a collaborative digital repository for contested material. The controversy did not end neatly. It forced institutions to reckon with past choices and to create mechanisms for accountability. It also sparked wider conversations about the costs of silence and the responsibilities of caretakers. There is a price to reclaiming buried truth. These artifacts are not merely curiosities. They are evidence of social systems that turned bodies into instruments and of decisions by later caretakers to hide inconvenient facts. We have traced inscriptions, forensic reports, restoration notes, and eyewitness accounts that together change how we understand certain temple rituals in ancient Egypt. The aim is not to sensationalize, but to document and to insist that transparency matters. If you found this important, subscribe to follow updates and join the conversation in the comments with rediscovery followed by the find you think needs re-examination. For deeper reading, click the video suggested on screen that shows the full dossier and the translated papyrus. Thank you for watching and for keeping the search for a fuller history alive.